Hello everybody, welcome to week 8 of FXPHD's vry102 class. Today we're going to be continuing with the look dev of our alien from last class. Here's a closer up render of where we left off last week, which you can find in the file alien bust vo2 that you can download with the week 8 project files. Today's goal is we're going to add a shell to the exterior skin of our alien by using a blend material, some displacement map. We're also going to fix up the eyes, and lastly, we're going to add a little bit of fur to this guy here and there just to make him look a little bit more scruffy and mean looking. Now, just like in any good street fight, let's go in straight for the eyes. Now, if you'll recall, they have two parts to them. Bring up the shader for the corneas first. And right now, it's just a silly little blend. We're going to make ourselves a V-Ray material that will add on to the corneas. And to make the material transparent, you may recall from an earlier class, we talked about not using the opacity map. This just makes the object actually disappear where you want it to be refractive. And we'll be turning up the refraction color quite a bit. And we may be adjusting the refraction IOR to suit what the coloring is on the inside. So just to take a look, I'm going to take the eyes. I'm going to go ahead and hide them so we can take a quick look at a render of the alien without the corneas in place. And here we go without the corneas in place. You can see the eyes are kind of washed out. They're not looking so great. So let's take a look at their shader really quick as well. We'll see that that's just a regular blend as well. So let's go to a V-Ray material. We won't be changing much. We'll be adding this to our diffuse color and adding a little bit of a brightness by having some reflection to it, especially at the outer edges. We'll have Fresnel, we'll be using Fresnel, but with a higher IOR. Say about a 3, so we can get some reflection right into here, but we'll be diffusing that by reducing our gloss quite a bit. And a quick render of that once we assign them. Gives us a pretty neat look. And that was just a simple V-Ray material with some Fresnel on the reflections. It's kind of neat how one eye's a little bit different if we rotate him around. I'm going to set a bookmark so I don't lose my camera view. We turn the guy around and render this. We'll get to see that eye up close, and it looks pretty neat. Now the difference between the colors that we see here is obviously because of the light. So when we get more direct light on this eyeball, we'll start seeing that red pupil, but right now it's kind of neat that the light gives us that brighter eyeball on one side and a darker eyeball on this side. You can always accentuate this by adding a little bit of a kick light, and this is something we'll consider a little bit later on. But for now, let's turn our corneas back on through the outliner. We'll grab the corneas, Shift H to turn them back on, and we have attached to them our clear V-Ray material, which has a refraction on it, as well as an IOR of 1.6 right now for the refraction. We'll want to get some good reflection on it as well, and I am going to use Fresnel. However, I'm going to go pretty high on the Fresnel to get some reflection directly off of the surface to start seeing what that looks like, and then I'll start backing off on that as we go. Now, the refractivity and the IOR for the refractivity is going to change what the eye is going to look like a little bit. And yeah, we've got too much reflection going on. So let's set our IOR back down. So now our reflectivity is better. We've got a glint of one of our lights over here, but the eyes are black. If we take a look at the other eye as well, it's going to end up being black too. And if this were a live class, I would be asking everybody, hey, why are the eyes black? What's going on? Although that's kind of neat looking as well. Makes this thing look totally X-Files. But one thing you've got to keep in mind, when you're doing a refractive object, you usually, almost always, want to have effect shadows turned on. This way, the refraction also affects the shadows. Right now, the corneas are casting a solid shadow onto the eyeballs underneath. And with effect shadows turned on, the transparency will make these into clear shadows according to how refractive, how clear or cloudy that these are. So if we take a look at this now, we see that the cornea is now refracting the shadow. Now let's take a little bit off of that glint by introducing a little bit of diffusion into the reflection. Take the glossiness down, and that should dispel this a little bit. It'll be less glossy looking, obviously. So you'll want to experiment with the reflection gloss a touch to get the look that you're looking for. But this takes a little bit too much off, so I think just a hair under 1 will take the curse off a little bit and give us a pretty wet, slick eye, but just take a little bit of that sharpness out of that light's reflection, which will be nice. Go back and forth, see a little bit of a difference, and you can dial this back to taste. Now I'm going to settle on 0.90, and that will give us this look. So you can see there's a very slight difference in that highlight, and we'll keep it at that point. Go ahead and render the other eye, make sure everything's okay on that one. And indeed, we're sitting pretty with his eyes. One other thing you can experiment with is tinting the corneas a little bit. So if we go into the refraction, you'd be looking at the fog color. So for example, if we want to give him crazy red eyes, this will tint our refraction by introducing a little bit of a fog into our eyeball. And here we can see a pretty nasty looking red eye. If we want to back off on the amount of red, we don't want to do it through the value so much, because that will reduce the amount of the visible refraction we'll see. You're going to want to do it through the saturation to reduce the amount of color that's actually inside the fog. This will give us a little bit of pink in the whites of his eyes. and just an overall kind of reddish look. To get a little bit more alien, you might want to change your colors, maybe go to a blue or desaturated green, for example, just to get a little something different. And here, when we compare it to the pre-fog, we have just a little bit of a green happening around the eye color right there. Puts a nice little salt and pepper on it. We'll check to make sure nothing goes crazy on this eye, and we get a little hint of green in there off of the glancing angle, which is a nice little detail that you wouldn't otherwise see in there. So we're going to go ahead and keep a slight green on the fog for our corneas, and that gives us our eyes. Now let's get a shell on this guy by using a blend material. First, let's get our shader on the guy. If you recall, we created a skin material with all these different maps. I'm using the pink versions as opposed to the green versions that were also available to you from last class. And we created an extra bump material to give us some skin cracks as a bump, and that's giving us the texture, that kind of reptilian texture on his skin because of the extra bump that we have on here. So in creating a blend material, what I'll be doing is piping in our bump material with the middle mouse button over to the base. So the base is our bump material. And for a coat, I'm going to create a new V-Ray material. And for the sake of clarity, I'm going to change this to like a bright red, which I will then put on the coat material 0. And what this is going to do essentially is mix a little bit of red directly onto the skin. We do have to assign it to our object, of course, which is what I neglected to do. So we'll assign our blend material now, and we should see red showing up all over the skin, which is not exactly what we want, but it's the first step. And here we can see that red tint coming on through. Let's go ahead and kill this render. And what we need is a map that will go on to our blend amount to bring different areas of shell. For example, on the bridge of the nose, on the forehead. And that will all depend on the map that we create. Here's the original that was painted by Martin Punchev, who's the designer and the modeler of our alien. We have a few new layers I've added since last week's class, and here's one called Shell Amount. And this one takes bright areas and will give us more of the shell material. So we've got definite shell happening on the nose, on the forehead, a little bit on the chin and cheeks, and a little bit more on the back of the head, as well as the front of the throat. We'll also be using this as a displacement to bring that shell even further. You will find that file as a JPEG in your source images for this week's download. Matter of fact, here it is. It's called Shell Amount 03. We'll be dragging that into our Hypershade. And there we go. This is Shell Amount 03 in your source images folder. This will middle mouse button drag right over to our blend amount and give us red areas that will show up as the shell. And here we see where our shell is going to very clearly be located. This sort of effect is also pretty good for doing a war paint or making it look like he just got sprayed with paint. But we're going to go ahead and add some color to our shell using our alien diffuse. Now I'm going to make a duplicate with connection to the network of our diffuse map. I'll feed that directly into our diffuse color, but I'm going to tint this slightly by adjusting my color balance. Under my color gain, I'm going to give it just a little bit of a bluish cast to it. We'll go ahead and render this now. And here we can see that shell starting to take over from obviously where the red was. And I use this so I can really make sure that my blend is coming on right. Here we are before the blend and after the blend. You can notice that I've lost all of that bump mapping on the blend part of the material, which is okay because we're actually going to be adding a bit of a displacement to this guy as well. Now let's take a look at our shell. Call this alien shell material. And you may opt to keep it pretty matte or flat. I'm going to add a little bit of reflection. However, its gloss is going to be pretty low, maybe around 0.4. And we'll have Fresnel, but I do want to unlock the Fresnel and give it a little bit more of a facing reflection to it. And we'll put this in our history buffer and take a look at this in a moment. Here we can see our reflection environment coming in a little bit with its blue sky. Next we'll be adding a displacement map. And we took a look at displacement maps in week 2 of this course. We'll be adding the V-Ray displacement, which is under Create V-Ray, and we'll be doing V-Ray displacement. If you are working in 3ds Max, this would be the V-Ray displacement modifier. You'll be looking for a modifier. And we'll apply a single displacement node to the selection. And here we see it in the outliner with our mesh applied to it. Our displacement material is going to be basically based on our shell amount. So I'll middle mouse button drag this over to displacement material. And this is going to give us some pretty crazy gnarly displacement. So I'm going to go ahead and just render this part without any further control over what I just added with the displacement node, or in Max the displacement modifier, and you'll see this displacement's going to be kind of nasty. And indeed it is kind of nasty. So we get some pretty gross sort of growths on him. We need to control this. And how do we do that? We do that by adding V-Ray attributes. First one would be displacement control. This gives you access to displacement amount. So we're going to want much less than that. So let's go to 0.4. Of course, your taste is going to dictate what level you'd like for the amount of displacement. But we also want to add controls for the quality of the displacement, as well as adding a level of subdivision for our model as well. Although we have pretty good tessellation already on this model, so if we do add any more subdivision capability, it'll be pretty low. So we can see that this displacement is doing much, much better, and it looks more integral part of his skin than these nasty tumors growing from his head. So we like that. Let's go ahead and add some quality control once we put this into our buffer. We'll go into the shape node and we'll add subdivision. We'll go ahead and add subdivision and displacement quality as well. If you'll recall from week 2's class, edge length has a lot to do with creating nicer looking lines when you've got smaller detail areas. So we're going to go ahead and decrease our edge length. The lower it is, the better the quality of the displacement. However, the longer the render times will be. And we'll leave our max subdivisions at 4. We have this in our buffer so we can see how much of a gain we get by subdividing at 4 and having an edge length of 2. And this will be to taste and for your tolerance for noise in the subdivision, as well as how far away the subject is going to be. The closer you are, the more detail you're probably going to want out of that displacement. Now, the displacement map itself is fairly non-intricate. It's pretty blurred, it's pretty overall, so there's probably not going to be too much of a need for a very low edge length because we don't have a lot of fine curvature and fine fissures and cracks to deal with. But this is where you'd come. If you start getting below an edge length of 1 for quality, you're going to get really, really abhorrent render times, and you may pass the point of diminishing returns. But again, it really depends on where you're at. So let's compare our edge lengths before, edge length of 4, subdivisions of none, and now we've added subdivisions and an edge length of 2. So quality's a little bit better. It's smoothed out, if anything, the mesh ever so slightly, and giving us a little bit more definition in even the non-displaced areas just by the subdivision alone. We can see up around here it's behaving a little bit better, so we'll keep the edge length. We haven't suffered too much of a render gain either, so I think it's worthwhile to keep. Now let's run a render for the whole of our alien and check out all the other areas that are being affected by the displacement map, making sure nothing goes crazy or haywire. Distributed rendering really helps out with your rendering chores, especially when you're doing look dev. If you're lucky enough to be in a studio where you've got some spare processors, getting as many cores over to your machine for distributed rendering, if you can grab parts of the render farm to go on distributed, it really helps out with the look development. And here we go. We've got a mean looking alien now. If we compare before we added the bump mapping, you can see we've got a meaner look to him. And you can obviously shave as much of the displacement as you want to reduce some of that bumpy nature, but certainly gives him more of a solid core look set against more of that vulnerable skin that he's got. And that's all controllable, obviously, through our shell amount, which rules both the location of the shell as well as the displacement of the shell. And it's just convenient that both of these can be used together in this case. Now let's add a little bit of light temporarily to this side of his face. We'll go ahead and we'll just duplicate this guy and move it over to here to add a little bit of a light. Maybe not so harsh. Try it at 15. And here we see our alien with a little bit more of that front light. Eye definitely pops out a lot better. And we can see that fleshiness versus the shell a little bit better than before. Although this is kind of a nice sort of sinister sort of lighting. When he does step into light, we can see that extra detail between the shell and the skin coming through. Alrighty, now let's add a little bit of facial hair to this guy. We'll be using V-Ray Fur. First, I'm going to take that extra light that we added to the front. So we go back to our mood lighting that we had from before. And adding fur in V-Ray is pretty easy. We'll select the object and go under Create, V-Ray, V-Ray Fur, and we will add a V-Ray Fur to the selection. Now you'll have to look at the end of this course video to see how to do this in 3ds Max. But for Maya, we just turn that on, and we've got a very hairy little guy here now. Let's go back to this view very quickly. We'll go back to the bookmark, and if I dare run a render of this at its defaults, I'm going to get something kind of interesting. And the default fur is going to give you something that's going to look, what's the word? Bad. The word is bad. By default, this is just not really workable. So we have to get to task on controlling our fur. If we take a look at the fur preview, when you select these strands, you also have access to the tab for the V-Ray Fur properties, which is also, of course, in your outliner as well. Let's just go ahead and call this facial fur properties. And we'll take a look at the attributes that are available for the fur. We've got length, obviously, which will control the length of the fur. And we've got thickness, which will control basically the density of the fur. Gravity is how much it will respond to gravity, which is by default set into the downward direction, as we'd expect. Bend is the fur's ability to bend. The higher the bend, the more floppy that will look. And undo that. And taper, well, it just tapers the fur strands. We've got a few variants, which is like a randomizing. For example, if we want to change the relative direction of each of these bendings, we can add that, and that gives us a more mottled, more of a random, fuzzy look. Go ahead, undo that. Length variance obviously will change the length per strand to be more random. Thickness, gravity, curl, all of those, again, randomize these values. Below, at the bottom of the attribute editor, we have slots to put our textures. You have a chance to slot in a different UV set. We have only one UV set for this guy, and that's map 1, so that's what's assigned to it by design there. And then we've got these textures that we can put in. So in our fabulous Photoshop experience here, I've also created a facial length map as well as a facial density map, with white being more dense and black being no density at all. I'm going to go ahead and add that map found in your source images folder called Alien Fur Density. We'll be using the facial fur density, and you'll have that in your project files. We'll load that into the hypershade first. There we go. That's our facial density 03. And we'll go ahead into our fur properties. And with the middle mouse button, I'm going to drag that fur facial density 03 map over to the density texture. Now it'll look like we've got hair coming out of our ears, a little bit off the cheeks, some off the nose. We have a little Fu Manchu mustache and a little bit of a goatee. It is an alien after all, so it'll look pretty neat. However, we're going to need to mitigate the thickness of each strand because they're looking like tubes here, and that's quite distracting. So we'll go up and we'll set our thickness to 0.01. That'll give us a much more believable thickness. We'll reset our length back to 1. And we'll leave pretty much everything else on its own. We'll create a little bit less of a bend to get the hair to stick out a little bit. We'll go to about 0.45 on the bend. Now, the more knots that you have for your V-Ray fur, the smoother these will bend. The smoother they'll be. It's like having more vertices along polygon's edge. It'll be smoother the higher the knots. We don't need to add knots. Our fur is going to be fairly short here. Add a little bit of a more of a directional variance to about a 0.5, 0.55. And also we'll reduce the gravity variance a little bit to get them all to point a little further down with each other. About 0.12 should do that pretty nicely. Now we should put a quick shader on this. So I'll make a regular V-Ray material and I'll make it a white, and just selecting the fur preview, I can go ahead and apply the material to the fur, and the fur will actually now be white. So we'll go ahead and re-render this mess of a frame, and we'll see that our density is going to be where we want it, and our fur is going to be much thinner than these really large, thick tubes. As we can start to see off of the ear, that fur is really crazy thick. So let's reduce the amount of the fur being applied through this map. We can go into Photoshop and darken all these colors down. However, if we take a look at its input and output connections, we can see that the map, the facial density, is connected to the density texture of the fur properties through its alpha channel, which means if we go into the color balance, we're able to adjust the overall contribution of that map to this attribute by adjusting its alpha gain. So we'll set the alpha gain to 0.03 to reduce the overall density. We just want a little bit of scraggly hair, little unkempt look on this guy. And here we have a better look at these whiskers, which are currently assigned to a very basic white V-Ray material that we can see here. But, you know, that's not really conducive to very good look. So we're going to have on our fur the V-Ray Material Hair 3 shader. Very interesting shader. We'll go ahead and assign it to our fur object right away. Now, with the decrease in density, there's not a whole lot of fur feedback we're seeing. We'll fix that in a second. But with that selected, I'm going to go ahead and assign it to our V-Ray Material Hair 3. And then let's go into our fur preview, and we'll turn up the number of strands tenfold so we can see a little bit better how many strands are coming out. Because, you know, in the end, we just want a little bit of whiskering and a little bit of that sort of unkempt alien look just got out of Long Night. And we want to get a better preview. So showing 50,000 max preview strands is definitely worth it. Now that we've added our hair material, let's put our current render into the buffer, and we'll go ahead and render a small part of this out, both the lit side and the unlit side, because the hair material has some pretty interesting properties to it. Take a look at the attributes while this guy renders over here. We can see we've got an overall color, diffuse color. We've got primary and secondary specular. This is a little bit akin to the fast SSS and the skin shader, particularly with the primary and the secondary spec. And then, of course, the overall and the diffuse color, we have a transmission color, which is also very, very similar to the fast SSS2 shader. We can start seeing some of that brown coming into the whiskers over here. And if we start highlighting our buckets on the backlit side, we'll start seeing some of that transmission and that brighter specular coming through, giving us a much nicer hair look than just a typical V-Ray material. Very quickly we can see how that hair looks much, much better as opposed to a regular V-Ray material. So let's get rid of that. This is now what is in charge. Our colors are actually pretty good for our alien right off the bat. But I do want to address some of the length issues. And that's why I've also created a facial length map, also found in the source images of your project download for this week. We'll be bringing alien facial length map into the hypershade. I'll go ahead and just drag that on in here. And we'll be adding that to the length attribute for our fur properties. Down here, we'll middle mouse button drag this over to length. And that will give us a shorter length on the ears and on the cheeks than on the Fu Manchu and the beard that we have. Although that's a little too short, but just like we did with the density, we can control the overall contribution of this map through its alpha gain, because the alpha is what's connecting to the fur properties. So I'm going to boost the alpha gain by 2.5, and we'll see that immediately. We've got little short hairs on the ears, and we've got better whiskers for his mustache and his beard. Take a quick render of the whole thing so we can take a look. And this is looking pretty acceptable for the amount of hair that we've got. We've got a little bit here and there, off the nose, the cheeks, the ears, looking good. And we got a bit of a whiskery goatee going on there as well. So we're happy with the length, we're happy with the density. Now let's talk about controlling the transparency of the fur. We'll go ahead and grab our hair material. And we've got transparency here that will basically change the transparency along the entire strand. What we want to do is we want to taper the transparency so it gets sharper or thinner at the ends of each whisker. Now to do that, you would want to use a ramp to create a black to white gradient, with black being opaque and white being transparent. And we'll set a little bit more opacity at the base of the hair strand, and we'll go fully transparent by the tip of the hair strand. However, it's not as simple as just assigning the ramp over to the transparency, because it will try to use UVs. We need to tell the fur that we want the transparency to go along the length of each strand of fur. To do that, we need to enable our vry fur sampler node. Now our ramp is set to a V ramp. This is important to remember because we're going to take our fur sampler, middle mouse button drag it over to our ramp, and we'll go ahead and click default, which will open the connection editor. We'll be connecting distance along strand to the V coordinate of the ramp. And then we can middle mouse button drag the ramp into the transparency attribute of our hair material. Now let's take a quick look at some of these whiskers with the new transparency involved. And as you can see here, it's really softened the ends of these hairs, and these whiskers look a lot more like whiskers. Here is our look from before and after. We have a much nicer fall off created by the ramp along the fur sampler's distance along each strand. Similarly, if we want to add a little bit of interest to the coloration, we're going to do kind of the same thing here. We're going to go on the primary specular. I'm going to store that tan color into one of our slots there, and I'm going to create another ramp. Oops. And this ramp will go from that tan color at the ends to a darker version of that tan color. Actually, we'll go to a bit more of a reddish brown. We'll have a little bit more of that reddish brown at the end. We'll squeeze that in. And again, we're going to want to take the first sampler and attach it to our ramp through the connection editor. We'll attach distance along strand, and I can use the same first sampler node. And we're going to attach it again to the V coordinate of our new ramp. And then we can middle mouse button drag the ramp over to the primary specular of our hair material. And let's make sure this is in our buffer. And we'll take a look at a full render of our new coloration as well as our new tapering from the two ramps that we just connected. And this gives us a little bit of a ginger color into our hair, which adds some nice depth and detail from what we had before, which was, a little flat. Now we've got a little bit more of a pizzazz coming from our whiskers. And we're done for this week's class. Next week we'll come back. We'll take this a little bit further. We'll add a little bit more body hair to the character. We've got some facial whiskers. Great. We're going to see about adding maybe some eyelashes, eyebrows, maybe a bit of a mane in the back, as well as rendering. We'll be rendering in elements and looking at back to beauty comps for generic scenes, as well as doing it for this guy in particular. And that will round out vry102. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for a really quick 3ds Max explanation of how to do this week's class in that software. Thanks very much. See you on the forums.
Hi, I'm Max.
And here we find ourselves in 3ds Max. This is the scene that we have from last week, which is called Alien Bust VO2.max. Now we'll start in on the eyes. Go ahead and grab these corneas, make sure we've got the outside corneas, which we do. And we'll graph the material on those objects. See that we've got a standard blend. What we did in Maya, we created a V-Ray material. And we'll go ahead and assign this to our eyes, which will make them opaque. And we have to set a white refraction color to make them refractive. We kept our IOR at 1.6. We added a little bit of a green fog color to those eyes. And if we go ahead and render, we'll see that the eye gets quite green. Same thing as we encountered in Maya with the opaque nature of that shadow. We need to turn on effect shadows for the refraction of that eye material. Once we do that, we'll be able to see through to the eye. However, the green is showing up much worse than it did when we were in Maya with a similar green color. So let's go back off on our fog color and getting it basically to where it's almost white is where we're going to have to be to get a very slight tinge of green into the eye like we did with the Maya version. We'll go ahead and render that eye, make sure nothing's wrong with that one, and good, we're all set. Now, we added a bit of reflectivity, and we reduced our glossiness to, I believe, about 0.9 for the eyeball. We're unlocking the Fresnel IOR. I need to unlock it so I can go ahead and punch in 2 for the eyeball, and this is what we'll get. We'll go ahead and put this into our history. So we can compare the eyeball with and without reflections. You'll see that we're getting that reflection of our lights and a little bit of the environment as well. You may want to back off on the glossiness to taste. That's up to you. And now for the shell that were created earlier by using a blend material. I'm going to go ahead and clear everything out of here by hitting delete. That will clear my workspace, my view space here. We'll go ahead and create a blend material, and I'll want to also pull in the bump material that is attached to our alien. We're going to feed our bump material into the base and just connect it right here of our blend. We're going to create a new V-Ray material for our coat. And we started this as a red material just so we can see exactly where that is going to. We'll need to assign our alien to our material, our new blend material. We need to go ahead and import our shell amount. Again, this is our JPEG called Alien Shell Amount 03, found in the folder you are downloading for your Max files. It'll be right there alongside your Max scene files. And this will be feeding into our blend amount. I can also grab the socket here and drop it right on our spot. We're going to do this as an instance. And there we go. It's plugged in. Everything should be good to go. And we'll try a quick render. And here we are. We've got our red put on top where our shell's going to be. So we're good to go there. Now at this point we'll be bringing in our diffuse map, Alien Diffuse 02 JPEG, which we've used before obviously for our skin shading. I'm bringing in a new one because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of a color tint. So we'll select our bitmap, and at the bottom of the parameters here, we'll turn on Enable Color Map, switch it to RGB. I'm going to go into my blue channel only and drag the point up a little bit, and that'll give me a little bit of a blue offset to it, just like we had in the Maya. So now that I've got my shell color, I'll be putting that into my diffuse, which I can plug in right here. And then this will now be the color that will show up. And if we do a quick test of this, we should be able to see that coming in just fine. And here we go. We're getting that shell with a little bit of that blue tint to it on top of the skin that we've got going on here. And let's take a look at some of those shell settings and make sure we've got about the same as we did in Maya earlier in the video. And we have a little bit of a reflection. We have a Fresnel that's unlocked. And that was, I believe, at 2.0. No refraction or anything. And I believe that's all good. So we've got fairly apples to apples. And at this point, we're going to be bringing in the displacement based off of our blend bitmap. So we'll go ahead and select our object, and we'll go into the modify panel, and for displacement, if you recall, we're going to be adding the V-Ray displacement modifier, and that pretty much gives us what we need to control it as well. And first up is our texture map. This is our shell amount. I can grab the output slot, go right into our text map. We'll use an instance, and there we go. Now we have a displacement that is not really controlled yet, so let's put in our numbers really quickly. Our amount was set to 0.4 in the Maya, and we had an edge length set to 2.0, also in Maya, with a max subdivs of only 4. We'll go ahead and render this out, and see what happens. And we've got just about the same, if not a little bit more displacement in here than we had in Maya, possibly. But by and large, this is fitting pretty close to what we had before. I think our shell settings are a little bit off here, however. So if we go back into our shell material, we have a reflection gloss of 1, where earlier we had it at 0.376. So we'll take our reflection gloss down to about the same, and then we'll get a nicer reflectiveness off of this. Now I'm going to reduce our overall bump here to about 0.3 instead of 0.4, and we'll strike another render and take a look at that. And that gets us closer. Now we have a little bit more light on this side of our alien in 3ds Max than we did in Maya. So you know, it's tough to be exactly apples to apples, but this is definitely close, very, very close, and certainly does illustrate the few workflow differences between Maya and Max you should be aware of. Now we'll take a look at fur. Now here's a full render with our displacement map and our shell material. Again, there's some differences in the overall look between this and Maya. Our lighting's going to be a little bit different. A few things are a little bit different, but by and large, the workflows have been compared pretty successfully. Now for the fur workflow, if we go ahead and select our object, we'll be going into Create, V-Ray, and we'll do V-Ray Fur. Pretty similar to what we did in Maya earlier. However, one difference I can notice right away is that the bending of the fur was much more articulate in Maya than it is here. Here we're getting a lot of fur that's kind of sticking out straight. And we'll take a look at the parameters for it when we select V-Ray Fur in here, and in the modify panel we can see we've got a full bend, and that number has to go quite a bit higher to get that same sort of bend that we had before. So let's reset that to 1, and one of the things to take a look at is the number of knots. The more knots you have, the more we get a smoother result. 8 knots being default for both Maya and Max. So at face value, all these numbers are pretty much the same as they would come in through. Let's go ahead and work our way down the parameter list here to our maps rollout. Here's where we will be attaching our various maps. And I'll be pulling in our alien fur facial density 03. So you can see right here, alien fur facial density 03 JPEG, as well as our alien fur facial length 03 JPEG. You can see here. So we've got the density and our length maps. So I'm going to connect, we'll start with our density map. Go from the output socket to our density map here and drop that right there. We'll have it as an instance, and that'll immediately take care of our density. Same thing with our length map. We'll go from the output socket over to the length map there as an instance. We'll drop that there. And here we go. We've got both of these working into our fur. However, our fur is quite long. As you may recall, we adjusted these in Maya using the alpha offset to reduce the amount of density and also to take care of the length. So we're going to have slightly different workflow here. But first, let's go ahead and take care of our thickness. We had at 0.01 for the thickness. You'll see that the length is at 15 here, but in Maya it's at 1. So this ends up being a multiplier for our length. So we can go ahead and set our length with this parameter, which will sort of factor the length of our whiskers. I believe we had an alpha offset of 2.5 for our length to multiply that a little bit longer. So we'll do about the same here and see if that ends up being accurate. But also our density was reduced quite a bit as well. If we go ahead and render this guy and see what the relative density is going to be for the fur that we have, we'll be able to gauge how much to offset exactly that we need. Again, in Maya, I believe we went down to an offset of 0.03 for the density map. So we may have potentially the same number here. We had a few stringy whiskers. Here we've got a much more dense goatee coming in here. And of course we haven't set any sort of color or material to this quite yet, but we can see that the fur's coming in at the same locations, seeing as the UVs are pretty much the same. However, I am definitely concerned about the wayward nature of the bend in these. Go ahead and stop our render at this point. We're going to want to reduce our density because we want some stragglers. We don't want a whole lot of hair here. So to do that, there's no percentage like there is with most maps in 3ds Max, but we can control the density map directly through the bitmap itself by going into output, and we can actually reduce the output amount directly. So we had about a 0.3 or so offset in Maya, and that should be about the same here. Though I think our length is a little bit longer in Max. So we can go back up to our length parameter and set this to about 1.5, maybe closer to 2 to get those whiskers to respond. Maybe increase our bend, potentially increase our gravity as well to get a bit more of a pull straight down to compensate for that wayward nature. We'll go ahead and render the bottom of the face here and take a look and see how our population and our bending is doing before we move on to adding our material to it. And here we can see our density is pretty good. We really should work on the shader at this point, the material to give to the hairs. And we'll start that by creating the V-Ray hair material. And we'll go ahead and assign it. We'll start by selecting our V-Ray fur object here in our Scene Explorer and assigning material to that selection. And doing a quick little render, we see that it's been assigned successfully and it's working out okay. Now, if we take a look at our hair shader, it's pretty much the same as we saw earlier in the video for the Maya hair shader. First, let's put an opacity ramp basically on the opacity to make the hairs thinner, like we can see here a little bit, but currently our render looks like this with pretty thick strands coming in. So to get that taper, what we have to do, it's a little bit simpler than it is in Maya. Instead of creating a gradient ramp and mapping it to a hair sampler info node or stuff like that, all you need to do is go into the opacity map for the hair material, and here you're going to select the hair info texture node. Once this is attached, you've got position along strand for your output. You've got a color A and a color B, which essentially becomes your ramp. If we just, based on this, go ahead and render the fur now, we'll see that the hairs will begin to taper because one end will become transparent and the other end will be opaque. Now this is opacity compared to how Maya does it, which is with transparency. And the opacity means white is fully opaque and black is fully transparent. And it's looking like the ends of our whiskers are fully opaque, which means we're going to need to swap the black and the white off of these colors. So let's go ahead and stop this render. And our color A will need to be white to be opaque, and our color B will need to be black to be transparent at the end of the strand. Go ahead and verify this. And as some of these buckets begin to complete, we see that the ends of our fur strands are indeed going transparent. So they're thinning out and they're looking much more like hair. So your color A has to be white, your color B has to be black, and this is piped into the opacity texture. And this is the V-Ray hair info texture that'll give you that. So no need to make any sort of gradients, any sort of gradient ramps like we did in Maya. And here's our full render. So we've got our fur going on. We can do the same with the hair material for our speck. Now, our primary speck in Maya was kind of a light tan color, something that we don't have going on here. So we're going to give it some of that blonde tan color that we had, give or take. But you may also recall that we actually put a ramp on that as well. So if we go into the primary specular and look for its map, here we go, primary specular, not the amount, but the actual specular itself, we can go ahead and do another hair info texture and set this one again to be position along the strand. And we'll do colors that give us a little bit of that ginger. Now we know from the opacity that color A is at the base of the hair because that's what's fully opaque. So we'll do kind of a reddish ginger color for the base of the hair. And then we'll do a much lighter tannish color for the end of the hair. Now our colors aren't exactly the same as Maya, but that's quite alright. We get the point. Let's see if we get a little bit of color variation going on in our render now. We'll go ahead and save this in our buffer. and try it on for size. And here we can see that that color is successful as the ramp shows up in our coloration for the specular, the primary specular indeed. The only disappointment being in the relative bend not quite working out the same as it did in Maya. We can try to increase that bend, try to increase that gravity a little bit to try to get that, perhaps even increase our knots slightly, but overall we have a different reaction than I would have expected out of 3ds Max compared to what's in Maya. Or I'm getting a different reaction in Maya than what's to expect in 3ds Max. We're not sure which is first, the chicken or the egg. However, I think the subtlety in the renderings that we were able to achieve in Maya, maybe a little bit of that lighting is different, of course, and we've spent a lot more time and energy explaining and working on the materials here than we have in 3ds Max. Indeed, the 3ds Max has been more about the workflow differences. So you're going to find some of the numbers are going to be a little bit different. You're going to have to change some of your reflection settings, some of your blend material settings, some of your fur settings to get a closer match to what we're going to get out of Maya. But overall, the workflow is pretty similar. It's just the smaller details that you really have to sit down and kind of find your own numbers for your own look. But the workflow issues are pretty evident. The differences are minimal, but they're enough that you should be aware that you'll be working a little bit differently in 3ds Max than you would in Maya. But by and large, except for a few small things, it's a fairly 1-to-1 ratio. When you get into skin, when you get into fur, there are scale issues, there are software differences, and I think they're starting to show a little bit in that regard here. Thank you for joining us. I hope this has been helpful. We'll pick this back up next week and do a little bit more with our alien guy. I will see you on the forums.